There is a piece of television history that was locked away before most people alive today were even born. Not lost. Not forgotten. Deliberately hidden. For 55 years, one episode of The Twilight Zone was pulled from every rerun package, left off every DVD collection, scrubbed from cable marathons, and quietly erased from the official story of one of the greatest shows ever made. No explanation was given to the public. No announcement was made. It simply vanished, and the people in charge seemed perfectly happy to let it stay that way forever. Fans who went looking for it came up empty. Historians who asked questions were met with silence. And the executives who made the decision to bury it never once stood up to explain themselves. But here is the thing about stories that get buried. They do not die. They wait. They sit in the dark and they grow heavier with every passing year, and eventually the weight becomes impossible to ignore. After more than half a century of silence, this episode is finally, officially, being shown again. The question is not just what is in it. The question is why they were so desperate, for so long, to make sure you never saw it in the first place. To understand what made this episode so dangerous, you first have to understand the world that created it. The Twilight Zone premiered on CBS on October 2, 1959, and from the very first episode, it was unlike anything television had ever attempted. There were no recurring characters, no ongoing storylines, no comfortable weekly heroes to root for, and no safe distance between the story and the audience. Every single episode was its own complete world, a new story, new faces, and always a descent into something deeply unsettling. What held it all together was one man and one voice. Rod Serling, the show's creator, head writer, and narrator, whose calm, measured tone could make the most ordinary sentence feel like the opening of a trap. He wrote or co-wrote 92 of the show's 156 episodes, and every word carried the weight of a man who had seen the real darkness of the world and refused to look away from it. Serling was a World War II veteran. He had served in the Pacific, witnessed things that never fully left him, and came home to an America that wanted nothing more than to celebrate its victory and move on. But Serling could not move on. He saw his country riding a wave of post-war prosperity, while underneath that cheerful surface, fear was eating everything alive. Fear of nuclear war. Fear of communism. Fear of anyone who looked or thought or prayed differently. Fear of the truth itself. And Serling wanted to hold a mirror up to all of it. The problem was that television in the late 1950s was not a place for difficult truths. Network executives were terrified of offending sponsors. Sponsors were terrified of offending viewers. And everyone was terrified of the political climate that had made simply asking the wrong questions a career-ending, life-destroying act. So Serling found a way around all of them. He wrapped his sharpest, most dangerous ideas inside science fiction. He set his critiques of racism on alien planets. He buried his warnings about authoritarianism inside stories about robots and time travelers and men who woke up in worlds that looked almost like home, but were just slightly, horribly wrong. The senses were too focused on the surface to catch what was really being said underneath. That was the genius of the Twilight Zone. It was the truth in disguise, smuggled past the gatekeepers in a costume they were too comfortable to see through. But even the best disguise has limits. And in May of 1964, during the show's fifth and final season, Rod Serling wrote something that no amount of clever packaging could soften. The episode was called The Encounter, and from the moment it aired, it set off a reaction that nobody at CBS was prepared to handle. It starred Neville Brand as Fenton, a white World War II veteran, and a young actor named George Takei, years before anyone knew him as Hikaru Sulu on Star Trek, playing a Japanese-American man named Arthur Taro. The entire episode takes place in a single attic. 2 men, 1 room, 1 sword, and 55 years' worth of unspoken American shame packed into 25 minutes of television that CBS would spend the next half-century pretending did not exist. The story begins simply enough. Fenton is cleaning out his attic on a quiet afternoon when Arthur shows up looking for yard work. Fenton offers him a beer. They start talking. At first it feels almost friendly, the kind of easy small talk between strangers that fills an idle afternoon with harmless noise. But there is something wrong from the very beginning, and Serling makes sure you feel it before you can name it. There is a Japanese samurai sword mounted on the wall of that attic. Fenton mentions it almost casually, the way a man mentions a fishing trophy on an old photograph. He took it off a Japanese soldier during the war. He says, and the way he says it tells you everything you need to know about the kind of man he is. Not proud exactly, but not ashamed either. Just matter of fact. Like the war gave him permission to take whatever he wanted from whoever he wanted, and nobody had ever once asked him to answer for it. Arthur stares at the sword. He cannot seem to stop staring at it. And slowly, painfully, the conversation between these two men begins to shift into something neither of them fully controls. Fenton starts to reminisce about the war, about the killing, about the enemy he faced and what he did to them. And Arthur listens, and something buried deep inside him starts to crack open. Then he says something that changes everything in that room and everything in the episode. His real name, he tells Fenton, is Taro. And his father, he says, was a spy for Imperial Japan who helped plan the attack on Pearl Harbor. The air goes cold. Fenton's easy, beer-drinking friendliness hardens into something uglier and more dangerous. And Arthur, instead of backing down or taking it back, leans into it with a strange and terrifying calm. He says the sword has a spirit. He says it is calling to him. He says it wants blood. And from that moment forward, neither man can bring himself to leave the room, and neither man can escape what they have dragged in there with them. What Serling created in that attic was not a ghost story or a creature feature, or even a conventional thriller. It was something far more frightening than any of those things. He put two men in a room who represented everything America refused to talk about, and he forced them to talk about it anyway, in front of millions of viewers who had no idea what they were about to sit through. Fenton was not a hero. He was a man who had killed people and taken souvenirs of the killing, and buried his guilt under years of alcohol and resentment in silence. Arthur was not a simple victim either. He was the son of a man he claimed was a traitor, carrying a shame he had never chosen, growing up in a country that had imprisoned his entire family not because of anything they did but solely because of what they looked like. Neither man was clean. Neither man was safe. And the sword hanging between them was not just a stage prop. It was every sin that both of them had inherited from a war that never really ended for either of them, a war that was still being fought in that attic in ways that no victory parade had ever addressed. That ambiguity was the problem. Not the violence, not the language, not anything you could easily point to and say that right there is the offensive part. That is what crossed the line. What made CBS executives sweat through their suits was that the episode refused to give anyone a comfortable place to stand and watch from a safe distance. When you watched Fenton, you could not dismiss him as a cartoon villain because he was recognizable. He was the kind of man you might have grown up next to, the kind of man you might have thanked for his service without ever asking what that service had actually required of him. And when you watched Arthur, you could not simply settle into the role of sympathetic observer because Serling would not let that be the whole truth either. The episode was designed to make everyone watching feel personally implicated in what they were seeing. And in 1964, that was considered not just uncomfortable but genuinely unacceptable television. The complaints started before the broadcast was even finished. Asian American community groups were furious that the episode depicted a Japanese American man confessing that his father had helped plan the attack on Pearl Harbor. And that anger was not irrational. It came from a very real and very raw place. In 1964, the United States government had barely begun to acknowledge what it had actually done to Japanese Americans during the war. More than 120,000 people, the overwhelming majority of them American citizens who had been born in this country and had never set foot in Japan, were forcibly removed from their homes, stripped of their businesses, their savings, and their property, and imprisoned in internment camps scattered across some of the most remote and brutal landscapes in the American West. No trials were held. No charges were filed. No evidence of wrongdoing was ever presented because there was none. They were locked up because fear and racism had been dressed up in the language of national security, and the government needed somewhere to put its panic. And in 1964, that government was still not ready to apologize for any of it. For an episode of a primetime television show to then suggest that a Japanese American character's father had actually been a spy, to give even fictional weight to the paranoia that had justified the internment, felt to many viewers like pouring gasoline onto a wound that had never been allowed to close. CBS panicked. The sponsors circled. The network was already walking a financial tightrope, fighting declining ratings and a production budget that kept climbing while the audience kept shrinking. Rather than stand behind Serling and his right to create complicated, morally dangerous art, the executives made the easier choice. They pulled the encounter from syndication. Quietly, without any public announcement, without any explanation offered to viewers or to Serling himself. When the show went into reruns, the episode was simply absent. When cable television picked up the Twilight Zone library, the encounter was not in the package. When home video arrived and devoted fans began filling shelves with VHS tapes and eventually DVDs, the episode was missing there too. It became a ghost story about a ghost story. Fans passed around grainy bootleg recordings and spoke about the episode in hushed tones. Some believed it had been physically destroyed. Some thought the whole controversy had been exaggerated over time into something larger than it ever really was. And the decades kept accumulating, and the silence kept holding, and the episode kept waiting in the dark. But here is what the executives who made that decision never understood. When you bury a story because it makes people uncomfortable, you do not make the discomfort disappear. You just guarantee that the wound underneath it never gets a chance to heal properly. Everything that the encounter was trying to say about inherited trauma, about the lies that nations tell themselves to keep functioning, about the way guilt travels from one generation to the next like a piece of furniture that nobody wants and nobody can quite bring themselves to throw away, all of that kept being true whether the episode was airing or not. The attic in that story was not just a set. It was a symbol for something deeply, stubbornly real. A national storage space full of things we refuse to deal with, boxed up and labeled "Do Not Open," waiting for someone with enough courage to finally drag them into the light. George Takei understood that better than almost anyone alive. What most viewers sitting in front of their televisions in 1964 did not know was that the young actor playing Arthur Taro had actually lived the experience his character was reaching back toward. Takei was 5 years old when soldiers appeared at his family's front door. He has spoken many times in the decades since about what that morning felt like, about the way his parents tried to stay calm and composed so their children would not be frightened, about the guards with their rifles, about the train ride to the Rower Relocation Center in Arkansas, one of 10 internment camps constructed by the United States government in the months following Pearl Harbor. He spent years of his childhood behind barbed wire surrounded by armed guards, not because his family had done anything wrong, not because anyone had evidence of disloyalty, but because they were Japanese American and that was enough. He remembered guards pointing guns in his direction when he was a small boy. He remembered his father shielding him from the worst of what was happening around them. He carried that experience with him for the rest of his life, and it shaped everything he became, as an actor, as an activist, as a man who spent decades fighting for the historical memory of what his community endured to be preserved and acknowledged and never quietly filed away again. When the encounter was finally re-aired for the first time since its original broadcast, it happened without much fanfare. The Sci-Fi Channel, which had acquired the rights to run a full Twilight Zone marathon on New Year's Eve in 2016, included the episode in the lineup without any special announcement. No warning labels, no introductory disclaimer, no prepared statement from network executives about the complicated history of what viewers were about to see. Just the original uncut episode, dropped back into the broadcast schedule as if it had never been missing at all. The response was immediate, and it was overwhelming. Longtime fans who had spent decades hunting for recordings of the episode were stunned into silence. Younger viewers who had grown up hearing The Twilight Zone described as a classic series, but had never encountered this particular story, were shaken by how urgent and present it felt. Nobody watching it for the first time could quite believe it had been made more than 50 years earlier. It felt written for the exact moment they were living in. And the painful truth is that it was. Because the world that the encounter was made about never actually went away. The fear of the other, the way that fear gets picked up by people in power and aimed at vulnerable communities, the damage that does across generations to real families living real lives, all of it is still operating. In the years since the episode finally resurfaced, violence against Asian Americans rose to levels that shocked the country. People who were born in the United States, who have no other home, who have never lived anywhere else, were attacked and harassed and in some cases killed by people who looked at them and saw a foreign threat rather than a neighbor. The pattern that Serling traced with such precision in that single attic room in 1964, one man's inherited fear becoming another man's inherited pain, repeated itself over and over again in ways that made the encounter feel not like vintage television, but like a document of the present tense. That is the real reason this episode matters, and why its return after 55 years of silence is not just a footnote in television history. It matters because Serling understood something that entire generations of powerful people have spent enormous energy avoiding. Trauma does not respect timelines. It does not politely resolve itself once enough years have passed and enough apologies have been issued. It goes underground, and it waits, and it finds new shapes and new targets, and it keeps spreading damage until someone is willing to drag it into the open and look at it without flinching. The encounter did that. For 25 minutes, in a single attic, with 2 actors and 1 sword and no special effects and no score swelling beneath the dialogue to tell you how to feel, Rod Serling made America look directly at itself. CBS could not handle what it saw, and so they put it back in the box, closed the lid, and hoped the whole thing would eventually be forgotten. But you cannot seal truth away forever. After 55 years, the encounter is finally being shown again. Not because the world has grown more comfortable with what it contains. Not because the wounds it opens have healed or the questions it raises have been answered, but because enough time has passed and enough damage has been done by the silence, that people are beginning to understand what it actually costs to keep running from the things we do not want to face. The Twilight Zone always lived in the space between the story you think you are being told and the truth living underneath it. This episode was the most honest and the most dangerous thing Rod Serling ever put on film. And it was hidden for more than half a century because in the wrong hands, or perhaps in exactly the right ones, honesty has always been the most frightening thing in the room. If this story opens something in you, do not let it close again. Hit that like button, share this video with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to this channel so you never miss the stories that the rest of the world would rather keep buried. There's always another one waiting.